Alrighty then. Well, let's get going. Um, we've got a few people here. I suspect a few more people will filter in. Um, I have to apologize because I know good to see you also, Vincent. I know we sort of screwed up on the calendar this time. This webinar was in the calendar for last Wednesday, except it was in the calendar for this Wednesday, but we sent out a message about last Wednesday. So I'm glad a few of you have appeared. I appreciate that very much. Hi, Erwin. Nice to see you also. So this might be a pretty short one, and it may be fairly obvious to people what we're talking about here. But, decisions are a big deal, and they're valuable for jobs of every kind. And so let's kind of get into it. I think there'll be a fair amount of time. What I'm hoping is that you all will basically, take some notes while we go, so that when we get to the end, which will probably be considerably before the end of the hour, you'll have some observations. Because I know this group of people, I see some pretty experienced folks in this room, and I'm sure there are people who have some useful insights. So try to kind of take some notes and stuff about comments, questions, examples, that kind of thing. Again, the usual, this will be on YouTube in a few days. And I find it hard to believe, but we have 40 recorded webinars. This is going to be the 41st. We've been doing this for almost 3.5 years. And we've also got some presentations and such that are pretty valuable to people. And this is a pretty useful, we find more and more people are finding it useful. They're sharing it with their stakeholders. They're using it to get different ideas. And some people are even starting study groups with it. You can point your phone at that QR code and get on our list to get free study guides. So that's important. And of course, if you're watching the recording on YouTube, we really love it if you'd comment, first of all, comments, questions, observations, pass it on, subscribe, the usual, but it would be helpful to get this stuff out to as many people as possible. Now, as usual, we've got lots of webinars planned. They aren't planned exactly month to month. We have a growing list. And in fact, if people are interested in particular topics, you can always email me at carlbinder@sixboxes.com and suggest topics. But these are some of the ones upcoming. Consequences, it's not all about the money. It's actually prompted by a colleague of ours who has a rapidly growing set of behavioral health companies. And she's always getting requests from her supervisors to get gift cards and so forth. And she tries to clarify that really what we want to do is not just depend on money or programmed consequences, although that's often very helpful, but, to thank people, to make them, put them in contact with the natural consequences of their excellent performance. So that's a whole interesting topic worth exploring. Upside potential is the phrase that I coined years ago, some of you may know, for what Tom Gilbert called potential for improving performance. We changed it because PIP, the acronym, means Performance Improvement Plan in a lot of companies, and that's not what we're talking about. But the core of it is exemplary performance. That is, how do we capture the bits, usually small bits of behavior that really exemplary performers use to be exemplary performers. And let's talk about that a little bit. And then we're actually working on a pilot now that I'm going to do this afternoon, and we hope to turn into an application kit. But it's around leadership and management best practices. And so I'll probably share that with you all in the next few months. And next month, this is really just for people. Well, it's not just for people, but it's for people involved in sales enablement, sales training, sales operations, and so forth. And if you go to the registration page, which you can get to from our homepage, you'll see the little blurb we put out there. And Ian, who is here, and my colleague Barbara Buckland, and our director, John Skank, who was a client of ours actually years and years ago when he was senior vice president of sales at Dun & Bradstreet. We've always been kind of amazed how few companies in their sales departments actually document their successful sales process. They may have some generic models for phases. They may have some important stuff that they talk about, But the fact is, when you speak with successful salespeople, there's a lot of milestones or what could be called advances in their successful sales process that are almost never documented. And our experience is, after on and off about 35 years of working in sales enablement, is that there's an opportunity to much more precisely define what successful salespeople accomplish at each step, including things as small as, receptionist gives me her cell phone number, which has a lot of implications for example, a medical devices salesperson. And we want to talk about what we mean by this, but what we mean by documenting advances or milestones in the sales process and what the potential for that is. So that's not next month, though, I should mention. In May, because I'll be at both the International Society for Performance Improvement and the Association for Behavior Analysis International conferences, there's not going to be a lot of time this next month for a webinar. So we're taking a month off. But in June 12th, we'll have this one. So what's today's agenda? As I mentioned, it's moderately short, I think. We want to talk about, I think to this group, probably an obvious question, but people talk about, well, is decision-making or are decisions, is that a behavior or accomplishments? How do we think about that? So we want to talk just a little bit about that. And then use a few examples to illustrate, and all of you know, that there are countless types of decisions, depending on what the roles are, what the processes are that you're involved in. And what we notice as we work with practitioners, because I spend most of my time these days coaching people through projects using our methodology and our performance thinking practitioner program, what we notice is that decisions often don't get captured. They don't get documented. They don't get recognized. And decisions, especially for people like customer service people or factory maintenance people or senior leaders, those are super high value things. So we want to talk about that to just flesh out examples and maybe see if you guys have some ideas or some examples that are not like ones we're thinking about. And then, as some of you who know about our performance thinking methodology recognize, I think, we talk about criteria for good work outputs. And what we mean by that is when you define an accomplishment or a work output, we want to know what constitutes a good one. What's a good proposal? What's a good widget? What's a good relationship? And what's a good decision? What are the characteristics or criteria of decision that make it a good one? Because that allows us to count, to set expectations, to provide feedback, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. How we decide based on those criteria. And then just to make the point that in the decision-making process, people talk about sort of gut level decisions, or there's the old cliche in business where they say, well, people make their decisions based on their instincts and then they try to justify it with data. But among other things, if you're really clear about what a good decision of a particular type is, whether it's a hiring decision or a funding decision or a decision to choose A versus B, whatever those choices might be, those have high leverage, and being clear about what a good decision is makes a difference. So that's kind of the scope of what we're going to talk about. And then, as I say, I really hope that you guys will be actively engaged during this, writing some notes down so you can share them and your questions and so forth at the end. So the first one is pretty obvious, but our decisions behavior or accomplishments? And it's kind of obvious, I think, but I think it's worth pointing out that they're really both. That the decision itself is an output, it's an accomplishment. But of course, how we make a decision can be very complicated. Every time I go on Amazon.com and try to figure out what microwave oven to buy, or which cat food or kitty litter to buy, or whatever it is, I have to make a decision. And I may go through all kinds of things. I may look at the customer reviews. I might look it up on the web. I might do all kinds of stuff. I might talk to my friends. But in the end, my decision to buy a product makes a difference. It's very important. So that decision itself is an output. And one of the things that some of our mentors, Tom Gilbert in particular, used to say is that accomplishments or work outputs you leave behind. That is, you produce a thing, and then the behavior, the one who's behaving, sort of figuratively or literally goes away. But the accomplishment or the output remains. Now, even an accomplishment which is not a tangible thing, a thing like a decision or relationship, once established or produced, it's a thing that exists independent of the person who behaved to produce it. Now, you may have to maintain it. You may have to do things to keep it in good condition, whatever it is. But clearly a decision is an output, whereas behavior is what you do to produce it. Now, as I think everybody here knows, we trace our kind of lineage back to not just B.F. Skinner, but Tom Gilbert, who has been called at times the father of human performance improvement and so forth. Although if you talk to some people, they would disagree, particularly if they're Gary Rumler's colleagues. There's always debate about who the guy was or whatever. But this was an important book, and we always go back to it, and probably almost everybody in this attendee list has perhaps seen me or someone else quote this. But, Gilbert talked about in the fact that in the great cult of behavior, as he talked about it, and he really meant everybody. He meant leaders, managers, training people, you name it. In the great cult of behavior, behavior is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But then the critical thing is, he says, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, that absolutely mirrors what we know about decision-making, because in decision-making, we'll go through various kinds of activity or behavior, but at the end, we come up with a decision. And if it's an important decision, it's valuable. And I think this kind of equation from Tom Gilbert highlights that. And I share this a lot with people. And we don't necessarily pursue it as a quantitative thing. Some of you may do so in some of your work, trying to demonstrate ROI. But, Gilbert pointed out that the worth of any effort to improve or develop performance is equal to the value of the accomplishments, which are things in one form or other, divided by the cost to support the behavior. And so we support people's behavior. We pay them, we hire them, we give them, an environment, we do all kinds of things to support them, and that costs us. And what we're looking for is them to make accomplishments or contributions or work outputs. And current day terminology talks about that being return on investment. So I would say that a way to think about this is behavior is how we decide, and accomplishments are what we decide. In other words, I've decided to buy a Tesla, and I have my reasons for it. And I went through 2 years of asking Tesla owners about how they like their car and looking it up and all that. And I don't really care if the owner, if the CEO of the company is a nice guy or not. The car is a decision I made about, and I decided to purchase one. And that's a very highly valuable decision because it costs a lot of money. But I went through a lot of activity to produce it. How I decided that might have been different from how other people would do it. But what I decided was to buy a particular automobile. Now, you all know that we use the performance chain, or probably most of you know this. This is our simple model of performance. And we use it because after looking at all the different models and frameworks and methodologies for performance improvement, we think it all boils down to this: that in any environment where performance is involved, there's a bunch of stuff, behavior influences we call them, that influence behavior. And then there's behavior. But the whole point of the behavior, those tasks and tactics and procedures and activities, is to produce valuable work outputs or accomplishments, and they're valuable to the extent they contribute to business results. Now, we sort of emphasize criteria and so forth, but we'll come back to that. If you think about decisions as accomplishments, in a process, it's very often quite easy to discover them. Because in processes, when people do process mapping, they even have a special, a special symbol, the diamond, that you can see those two diamonds that I pointed out with the arrows. Those are decisions. And in most forms of process mapping, even the simplest forms, there's a place where people have to decide X or Y, and that's a thing. And interestingly enough, if you look at most process maps, usually, not always, in this case, these are good examples, but very often people have behavior in the boxes, and then they have a decision. And they might write the decision as a question or as a comment about what you have to do. But in the end, that branch of yes, no, or whatever the decision is a thing that's the product of activity. And so it's usually pretty easy to find those in process maps and when you're thinking about processes. It's not always so easy when you're looking at individuals. Now, this is a tool that many of you may know about. We call it the individual performance map. And it may be a little hard to read on your screen, depending on what computer you're looking at. But we tried to highlight some of the decisions that this editor-in-chief of a scientific journal is a particular individual, actually a friend and colleague of mine. What she produces, all of these things, these are all accomplishments or outputs, but the ones in orange are decisions. So they have to decide to approve a manuscript for publication. You can see delivering that to the publisher. They have to deliver various editorial decisions as a category to the associate editors. They have to deliver to guest editors some decisions about how to approach this, and also assignments. They have to say, I want you to edit this versus some of your colleagues who were also on the list. Now notice, and you can go through this, but one of the things you'll notice is that sometimes people use different words. So for example, an assignment may be the thing you hand the person that says what you want them to do, but implicit in that, if not explicit, is a decision. You decided to assign it to guest editor X, or you decided to assign it to your colleague. Or there are things like, some other ones in here, choice of special section topics. Well, that's another way to talk about a decision. She had to choose. So one of the things I think is important to notice is you can go through a conversation, as we do countless times in our performance analysis when we're focused on roles, creating individual performance maps for a series of individuals so we can understand that role better, what their contributions or outputs are. And most of the time, in my experience, whether I'm interviewing frontline, so-called low-level individuals or senior leaders, we'll get to the end of a maybe 45-minute conversation, and I'll recognize that they didn't mention any decisions. So I almost always have to ask about them. It's like relationships as important outputs. You get to the end of the conversation, you say, hey, by the way, you didn't mention any decisions. Are there different types of decisions that are really important for you that you make and pass on to some of your customers or your recipients? And usually there are. Usually you say, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And so you ask about them. And if you probe, for example, if you are doing executive coaching, which I often do with this tool, and you have their picture of their contributions, they're basically their job profile in the form of a map, and you say, what are some of your most important or high value or high leverage accomplishments? And dollars to donuts, there will be a few of those that they did decisions. They're funding decisions, they're hiring decisions. The CEO of Tesla and SpaceX and other companies points out about himself, he says his most important skill is selecting good people. And his companies tend to have extraordinarily skilled engineers and such in them. And he, for example, with SpaceX, when he formed SpaceX, he was personally involved in the first 3,000 hires in that company. And that says a lot about the CEO and primary investor, founder of the company being that level of involved. Well, it's true for all of us that often decisions are among our most important outputs or accomplishments. And we kind of have to look for them, because they're implied, they're implicit often. And a lot of times it says there, we use different words like approvals or assignments. So particularly when, in processes, it's not so hard to find them, but in the individual, you got to probe sometimes. Now, here's a few examples. This is just 3 kind of arbitrary roles. Just picked some decisions out. So customer service representative have to decide to escalate a call to senior customer service rep or not. I used to do a lot of work in call centers, And it was a whole big thing. They didn't want too much escalation. They had one of the indications of how well you trained your frontline customer service reps is whether they were able to handle stuff. And a lot of times they would, out of fear that they didn't know what they needed to know, or they were new to the job or whatever, they would escalate to the more senior people. And those senior people will be overwhelmed with more stuff than they should have to handle. So the decision to escalate a call or not is a really important decision that has ramifications, among other things, for customer satisfaction. Because if you're the customer and your customer service rep says, well, wait a minute, I got to talk to my manager about this, and then they disappear for 5 minutes, you might not be so happy about that. And not only that, but from the customer service call center's point of view, it's a productivity issue. And notice there are criteria. What we're saying here is, and these are not perfect criteria for every location, but these are examples. To escalate or not, what we call criteria for a good one, it needs to involve a topic on the escalation list. In other words, in some settings, and for example, insurance companies and others, there might be certain topics that you don't want anybody but the senior people addressing. Or if negotiation is required, if, for example, a call center environment where people might be talking about a past due bill, you might have to escalate the call to a collections specialist because they know how to do that negotiation. Or if you just can't find the online resources that you need, you might say, oh, I better escalate this. Now, there may be other criteria for a good one, but those are three criteria which are good indicators for making that decision to escalate or not. A system to be used. Now, I know there's a couple people here who I recognize having worked in call centers before. I think Vincent did at one point, and I think others did. And if you think about a lot of environments, especially a few years ago, I think it's getting better now, but I remember when I was working at AT&T Wireless as a consultant about 15 years ago or so, these people had a whole bunch of software systems to use. They had like 4 or 5 or 6, and they were not all compatible with one another, and they had different user interfaces, and it was kind of clunky in some cases. And sometimes there were ways to find information through various different systems. So the question is, if you want to optimize the performance of your customer service representative, like, how do they make the decision about which system to even use? And so some simple guidelines, rules, or criteria are, if it's specific to the customer, look in the accounts app. If it's product specific, look in products and services, which is a different system. And when you can't tell these days, use artificial intelligence finder, use AI finder, enter the question, and you'll probably get directed to the right system. And again, there are some organizational or business results that are at stake here. There's customer satisfaction because you want to get back to people or give them the right information. There's productivity, and there's also employee satisfaction. One of the things I certainly know from people in environments where there's a lot of different software systems, some of which might not be so easy to use, is that employees can get pretty annoyed by having to deal with lousy systems. And so being real clear about what the decision is and enable people to make a good decision makes a difference. So those are just a couple of examples from that world. Then you go to a completely different world, the chief learning officer for digital transformation. I was working with a fellow there. So Vincent has a great comment in the chats. They use their exemplary performers to help identifying those criteria. Exactly. That's where we want to go for criteria. And we're not focused exactly on criteria now, but this slide and the next one sort of highlights that. And it's a very important point, because when it comes to decisions, you're trying to figure out, how do I make the right decision? And if you've got top performers who are highly productive and keep their customers pretty darn happy, then you probably got to look at how they do it and capture that. So thank you for that, Vincent. Chief learning officer. Actually, I did some work with a fellow some years ago who was a chief learning officer moving into a role for digital transformation, as everybody talks about now. Couple of decisions that he had to make. One is, how do you select the directors that you put out in the field in your organization to sort of promote and support and be change agents for digital transformation? Well, you make that decision about who based on their being experienced and informed users of current technology. on there being also probably a rapid system software learner. That might mean another criteria of like under 35 or something these days. I'm an old guy and I get annoyed by systems, but you want somebody at whatever age who learns pretty quickly when it comes to software. You want somebody who's a passionate advocate in this particular role because you're trying to transform the company. You're trying to engage people in using the new technology. And then you also need somebody who has leadership and influencer experience and accomplishments. So you can say, this person is not a wallflower. This person actually engages with folks and is a good leader. And there's a lot banking on that. Your choice of who you're going to put out in the field to be kind of your change agents for digital transformation could affect innovation in your company and how rapidly it's accomplished. Could certainly affect productivity if the new systems, the new technology is designed to improve productivity. Could affect operational efficiency in the same way. And again, employee engagement, like, are people into it or not? So that's an example. Another example for a CLO for digital transformation might be the selection of the technology itself. If you have the opportunity to bring in some new learning or performance support technology, how do you make decisions about what to bring in? And I know a lot of people who are in that kind of position where they do requirements analyses and they then, talk to vendors and they have vendors come in and do their demos and all that. They've got all kinds of selection criteria. But for example, to make that decision, you probably want as close to you can for that software to have a frictionless user interface. And for both the people who are managing or implementing it and for users, I'm sure everybody in this group has seen systems implemented that maybe the technology works great once it gets going, but you can't figure out the user interface. There also needs to be a good support system and documentation so that as much as possible, users can get their own help rather than requiring the overhead of a lot of tech support. That at least is a criterion for making that judgment. It ought to all work together. In other words, as much as possible, your different systems ought to be interoperable depending on the context. And it may be a kind of criterion might also be, let's not get the Cadillac if we don't need the Cadillac. Let's get one which is not overburdened by features. Let's get a system which really does what we need and not a lot of extra stuff, or possibly that you can add to and expand, but as in its version that we would get is as simple and straightforward as possible. And then probably you're looking for a company that has a good reputation, highly regarded company in product support. So those are just some examples. And again, that decision may impact employee engagement, operational efficiency, productivity, other stuff. Third kind of role, go, no-go decision with an executive. And that's a general category, but many, many senior leaders have to decide whether to fund or move ahead with or devote resources to a project or not. And so one of the things is, if you're telling that executive, you got to go for this, you or the executive, whoever you are, you may be the executive, you may be somebody that works for that person, but there needs to be some conviction and advocacy. You ideally are making something that can be strongly supported by the person who's going to go with it. And hopefully it will be led by either the, convinced advocate executive or somebody who's a strong lieutenant who that person absolutely knows will run with it effectively. Also, could be a criterion that whatever this thing is we're going to go with, it better be implemented with existing resources, because we don't want any unexpected expenses. And then the ROI has got to be convincing. Now, again, there may be other factors, but those are examples of criteria for a good go, no-go decision. And then finally, decision about an executive successor. When people are doing succession planning, a lot of times there's a natural and obvious successor, but sometimes there's multiple candidates. So if you, for example, had done an individual performance map of both the person who's being succeeded and the successor, you might say, okay, the candidate for succession ought to have a pretty good match of their current accomplishments or work outputs and components with what's going to be needed to take on the bigger job. Probably their values need to align with that of the whole organization. If this is a strategic enough role to have a succession plan, then it's probably better be aligned with values. In many cases, you want an internal hire. You don't always, but in some cases, you might say, look, there's too much going on here. There's a bunch of company and cultural experience we need to get people up to speed on fast. So if we can make an internal hire, it will be better. And then, if you look at a succession plan which focuses on stepping through the accomplishments this new person needs to master, it looks doable. It looks like we can pull it off by the time that's needed. And that has lots of implications. So these are just examples. And the reason that I share them, probably spend a little bit too much time on them, but is to notice there's a lot of different kinds of decisions, large and small. They have different organizational result implications, and they have different criteria. Now, in processes, we don't have to go through this in all the same level of detail, but here's 3 examples of processes. In a factory maintenance process, when you're putting the machine back together, is the sub-assembly ready to attach? Yes or no? Well, everything up to spec, the bolts and nuts, the tighteners, all, yep, okay, we checked that out. The gaskets are in place. They've got the sealant, it's properly set. And the input and output channels, pressure tests are within range. Now, there may be a whole bunch of others. There may be a whole checklist. But the point is, a lot may be riding on whether you put that back together and whether the subassembly is ready to go. So you better make a good decision there. And then once the thing's all put together, lubed, cleaned, blah, 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 are we ready to turn on the switch? Well, all the checklist looks good. That's a criterion. We don't have any stuff in the way around that's going to cause trouble, the debris and so forth and the operator's in place and got safety gear on. So flick the switch. So those are simple decisions in a factory maintenance environment, maybe. In a policy document development process, if you're developing a policy document, is it one of the outputs in there in that process might be, is this first draft even ready for review? I know it's the first draft, but there ought to be some criteria here. Well, all sections at least have some draft text is a criterion. Spelling and grammar is pass check. I mean, that's easy in the first draft. Authors' questions and comments were needed. In other words, you draft something, and the reviewer ought to be able to see where you're still kind of trying to figure it out or where you have questions for them. And then the content meets requirements of the contributing subject matter experts. If they're subject matter experts who've contributed to this, you vetted what you put in there from them. And those documents and that decision about a first draft could affect certainly ultimately the quality of a whole bunch of things, depending on what the policy is about. Productivity, because you want to be able to, you don't want the person to send it back and say, can you please spell check this first, and operational efficiency, and also employee engagement. You can move things forward. Those are just examples. Priority for publication. This is not just a yes, no thing. This is a case where perhaps if you are developing policy documents and you're revising a whole set of them, and you say, is this one ready to go now compared to the other one? How do we line this up in terms of actual putting it in the system and, sort of blessing it and saying we're ready to go? Well, there's a bunch of topics for the next 3 volumes or sets. And so let's match those up with the topics. High, medium, low impact for risk. So let's be real careful on this stuff that's risky. So maybe that's not the first thing we want to put in there. And then it's in the pipeline relative to other contributions, like the people who've drafted and edited this thing are sort of ahead of everybody or behind everybody. Those are 3 kinds of criteria that you might use to decide whether we put this one on the list to get implemented and system, put in the system now, or whether we go a little while for it to go live. And then finally, if you're allocating funds, that's often an important process in different kinds of contexts. A lot of times there's a fixed budget. And this could be in a government environment for that matter. And you say, well, this is how much our budget is. One of the decisions we got to make is whether we can afford to do it all. Yes or no? Well, maybe one way to think about it is this number would certainly cover about 80% of all the requests. And since the requests have ranges in them, maybe there's some wiggle room for some project funding decisions or timelines. And there's some high impact ones we got to fund for sure. And if we can't quite do it, if we can't afford to fund them all, are there some triage criteria? Are there some guidelines about what to offload for the future or whatever? So again, those are just some criteria. But if you can clarify those criteria, then it's more likely that you'll make a good decision rather than just from your gut. And then once you've made that decision, someplace down that process, there may be, okay, how much do we really give each of these groups? And so clearly the critical high priority projects need to be covered. Based on priority, let's figure out what the most important unfunded ones are that we fund before the later ones. Is there room to tweak the amount a little bit, and the timing maybe to put it off? And some of these projects are going to have to sacrifice something because they're not going to get all their money. So let's investigate about whether that's workable or not. So again, that might not be a complete list, but it's the beginnings of a list of criteria for making that decisions. So this is kind of a long-winded thing I've just gone through here, but I was trying to point out that decisions are not always even recognized as accomplishments, and some of them are really high leverage, and it makes a difference whether you clarify things or not. And what I would say is that clarity is sort of what's important here. We really say that if you define decisions as accomplishments and criteria, you can really clarify expectations for people. And not only that, but if you have those kind of criteria listed, you can provide feedback. You can do postmortems. You can do problem solving. You can look later and say, this turned out to be okay. And so the criteria, you might even revise the criteria, but they give you a way to decide rather than just, it looks pretty good to me. And it also is that from a risk point of view, we may be able to avoid some problems of making bad decisions. Even if we can eliminate a few bad decisions, that might be helpful in a lot of cases. And not only that, but if we find opportunities that, our criteria weren't quite right there, we discovered something else we shouldn't have paid attention to, that can drive continuous improvement in our process. Or what, again, going back to Vincent's comment in the chat, it may be that we talk to our exemplary performers and they say, I've been thinking about this. One of the things I do when I make this decision is X. And you figure out either their behavior or their criteria or both. And so you can continuously improve your decision-making process. Now, as many of you know, the way our so-called methodology or approach works is we go through the combination of the two models in a sequence. We say, what's at stake for the business for this hunk of performance, which may include decisions? Do these decisions really have implications for business results? Are they valuable in that sense? And let's define the outputs. And now we can look at the behavior, and that's where we can go through a logical analysis. We can ideally talk to exemplary performers or successful performers. And then we look at the behavior influences and we analyze, brainstorm, and choose the right things to support good decisions, recognizing that criteria in box one set expectations, and then we implement, measure, and adjust. So I just mentioned this because what we were just talking about is in the context of this sort of methodology. So here's a few questions I want to pose and that I think need to be asked when you're thinking about this stuff. One of them is, again, have we captured all the critical ones? Because so often I get to the end of some analysis and I say, wait a minute, did we miss any decisions here? So Joe Halpin's got a good comment too here. So that's a good one. So let's come back to that, Joe, because I'll be done in a few minutes, and then we'll have a little time to talk about that. It's a really good thought. And then when you look at decisions, what's at risk for each one? Because that might tell you a little bit about how tough you need to be, how tight you need the criteria to be, how critical it is to get the decision right. And so that's sometimes very important to look at. And how much flexibility in criteria and behavior is allowable? That's one that's generally a performance issue, which is that, my former partner used to say, accomplishments or outputs of liberate behavior. And what she meant was, in many cases, if you can accomplish the same output, however you get to it, may not matter so much. But my silly example is always a nuclear plant or another place where there's a lot at risk. And yes, there you go, Vincent. You got another, picking your spouse. Absolutely. But with respect to flexibility of behavior and criteria, how tight do we need to be with this? That's also an important question, I think. And Joe may have some comments about that when we get done. And this is sort of in the realm of the exemplary performers. Are there past examples to study in M&A? Can we look at how people have made decisions before what the impact has been, to clarify criteria, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is really the same question in a way. If we take a look at our best people, people who consistently make, like, man, he always makes good hiring decisions. How does he do it? And I'm reminded of this silly stuff, probably more from the 70s than anything else, when there used to be people involved in talent acquisition, and they said, I always look at the guy's shoes when he comes in to see if he polished his shoes, because if he did, that means he has a focus on excellence. I think a lot of people don't even wear shoes you can polish anymore, so that's probably irrelevant. But there's these kind of hidden criteria that sometimes people have that are worth digging out. And again, how do your exemplary performers produce the decisions? Not only the criteria, but the steps that they go through. What do they look at? What are the considerations? And then, post-mortem at all points, it's sort of like, well, how are we doing? Are these decisions working out okay? So for me, those are all questions to consider. Yeah, there we go. Ian has Supreme Court decisions. Yeah, they made one a while ago about a woman's right to manage her own body that seems to be causing some trouble. But anyway, applying what we learn, in retrospect or in an ongoing look at decisions, are we making good ones? And again, this may relate to the DAI model. So then some takeaways, and then let's talk about it. Clearly, decisions are often very valuable, especially with senior roles, executives, leaders. Very often, those are actually their most important contributions, how they decide stuff and what they decide. We often don't identify them, and we often don't identify criteria for good ones. And I would argue that when you're bringing somebody into a job, whether it's a low level on, relatively, individual contributor, sort of at the bottom end of the totem pole, or succession planning for senior people, probably it would benefit from identifying some of the critical decisions involved in that job and sort of what the criteria are. So anyway, I'm sort of done, and we've got a few minutes left. And so I wonder, Joe, I don't, your comment about the DAI model, I know almost nothing about it. We could perhaps talk on this. I've never opened things up for people to use microphones. I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do, but if you could, but maybe typing is okay. What do you think? So, Erwin, leaders make numerous poor decisions that sub-optimize outcomes. Yeah, no kidding. Assigning the wrong people to projects, using political criteria, intervening with their decision too early. Yeah, that's an important point, and it kind of gets to the notion of reviewing how critical decisions are going. Like, could we improve on this? Like, what happened there? That kind of thing. I think that's a really important point, that a lot of times people make not so good decisions. Sometimes they're disastrous. Sometimes they can be recovered from. So, Joe, your question is good. You said, I've used the DAI model for decision-making. Not sure if others have, but it brings clarity to the decision-making process. I'm not actually even familiar with that model, Joe. Can you say a little bit about it, or maybe text a little bit about it? I could try this. Let's see. I'm going to, for the first time, turn this thing on. Says you can request to speak. And I don't know if that'll help any, but let's see what happens. If anybody wants to speak, I'm not sure how it works in Webinar Jam. Yeah, so somebody just raised their hand. Joe, go for it. Let's see if we can hear you. I'm not sure how we ensure that we can, frankly. Huh. Oh, I guess I get to accept. Okay, there we go. I don't know, man. Sorry, I'm not familiar with the user interface when it comes to having other people speak. I'm used to mostly texting. I thought it would work, but I'll have to practice with this a little bit, I think, in the meantime, because I'm not seeing how to do that. You've joined the room, that's for sure.
There it is. Yeah.
All right. Hey, there we go. It works.
It kicked me out and then brought me back in. So
tell us about that, the DAI thing. What is it? What is the?
Yeah. So essentially, it's it's a framework for making decisions. It forces you to make sure you have the right people involved in making the decision, right? All your stakeholders. It forces you to assign people roles. So there has to be a decision maker, the person who's going to be the final yay or no, right? It forces you to gain advice from those people who have um, a lot of information that you may need to make the decision, the proper decision.
Is there
And
anything like a checklist about stuff you should ask them about advice?
You can. So, the way I've used it in the past, you have a checklist on, what are all the things that you need to get from your advice givers?
Yeah.
And there could be multiple, right? What are the risks of making this decision, right? What's the negative consequences? What are the positive consequences? What are all the options we have? And out of all of those, what are the positive consequences of the different options we can go down. So yeah, you just make a list of, and it could be different. It's probably different for every decision you have to make, right? There's probably a few common checklist items,
Yes.
but probably for most decisions, they're different in terms of the things that you need from the advice givers.
Yeah.
And then it forces you to identify all the people in the organization who you need to inform about the decision. Because a lot of times in organizations, a decision is made and nobody knows what the decision is. Right? And then all of these actions are being taken throughout the organization based on that decision. And people are like, hey, why did that go away? Or why are we going in this direction now instead of that direction? Oh, didn't you hear the decision was made last week, that week, right? So it forces you to build essentially a change management plan around the decision that's been made, right? And then it also forces you to come up with a super simple template. It's like an A3, everyone's done problem solving. You've got the A3, you've got the statement of intent at the top and all the boxes for who should be involved and the rest. So you have a similar template to that. Mm-hmm. And because you have that template, all your decisions are documented, right? And they go into we used to put them in a single folder in Dropbox, mm-hmm. right? And just organize them by topic or function or however you want to organize it, so that anybody could go to that place and review any of the decisions that have been made and what the consequences are based on those decisions.
So tell me what kinds of decisions, because probably it's not applied to, what you were going to have for lunch, obviously, or whatever. So tell me where you've done that, especially where you think it's made a big difference.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me, and this is based on my most recent experience at a biotech startup, is go or no go decisions around research and development.
Yeah.
Okay, what avenue should we go on based on the indications that we're getting around the scientific evidence of the research that we're doing? What's the best path to take? Because research and development, if you're not experienced with research and development organizations, they won't just focus on one thing. They've got multiple things going on, testing all of their different theories about, how best this is going to work, applying this solution versus this solution, and, getting results back from testing on usually mice. I'm sorry for people who are animal lovers. Right. Yes, it does happen. They have to test these things on mice before they can test it on humans.
As it's described.
Right. But yeah, that's really, the highest level decision in a biotech, in the biotech world, is based on the research that we're doing. Where should we put our money? Mm-hmm. Right? Because that's, usually with startups, the money is limited.
Yeah.
And, on average, it takes about 10 years to bring something from research and development all the way to the market in terms of pharmaceuticals. Super expensive, billions of dollars, a lot of money riding on the line. And you have to make the right decision, or else, you've wasted billions of dollars on research and development.
It's fascinating to look at that from the perspective of the public, because I've worked with a lot of pharmaceutical and biotech companies also. And, there are a few of them that have that develop these drugs that are good for like 800 people on the planet or something, and it costs $1 bazillion, and they have to create a foundation to even raise the money to give the drug to the people who need it. But when I think about that, and then you also hear these days some generic drugs nobody's producing anymore because they can't make any money on it. So that's a big deal. Those kind of choices, that makes
So that's the highest leverage situation where I've used the DAI model.
Yeah.
But it's super simple. You can just search for it on Google, and you'll get tons of resources.
This is one of the.
Excuse me?
What does the acronym mean? What is DAI?
Oh, yeah. D, of course, is the decision maker or approver. A is the advice giver, and I is for informed. So, who is the decision maker? Who are the advice givers? And who do you need to inform?
So that's a useful acronym if you can remember what it means. A lot of acronyms are just short forms of some word. That's great. I like that.
Yeah. Well, the hardest part is just getting people to adopt it and use it continuously. Sometimes, from my experience, one group will use it a lot and you get a lot of really good documented decisions. But over here, another group will forget to use it, or it just doesn't become part of their, behavior.
What's the kind of lowest level kind of decision you've ever seen that applied to? The least risky or whatever.
Yeah, least riskiest is probably.
But where they really did it, they still did that DAI thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. I was involved in a couple of decisions on compliance documentation, right? How to document something the right way or according to regulatory, so we use DIA model for that.
Well, good idea.
Because it does, because even though it's not a very, critical step, it affects a ton of people.
Well,
especially in biotech.
In some companies, you're out of compliance. It costs you a ton of money sometimes, so it makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly.
That's great. Well, thank you. Yeah. I'm glad you were here on this, because that's a bunch of stuff I didn't know.
Glad I could share.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, and I'm noticing Vincent saying for no-go decisions, this is where criteria for good decisions are not created. So, Vincent, so can you expand on that a little bit? We just got a few minutes left, but I'd be interested to hear what you're thinking about, because it seems like those are the very places where people would at least informally say, this is what we ought to do, and we should make our decisions this way or whatever. Let's see if I can.
Just in terms of how people make the decision. I mean, I'm not understanding the question.
Yeah, me neither. I'm not sure either. Well, I'm just looking at Vincent's chat box.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm just looking at his comment, and I think what he's saying is that sometimes people make important decisions about moving forward. Yeah, okay, change management, we're ready to launch. Yep. Yeah, that's fair enough. So in other words, all the ducks are not lined up. You better have a clear definition of what it means to be ready to launch. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that I can see that. Yeah, that's interesting, because the other reason I sort of mentioned that it seemed to me criteria are there for both, setting expectations and providing feedback and revision, but they're also about alignment, like expectations always are. Alignment, like, okay, boss, we have this. If you have the list, you can say, wait a minute, I don't think this one's in place. Whereas if you didn't have the criteria, you can't make that argument. Very interesting. Well, thank you, everybody. Let me see. I think I've got a little bit of sort of shameless commerce stuff here left. I don't know if anybody here still remembers Car Talk and the guy, Click and Clack the Tappet brothers and their automobile repair radio show, but they always used to talk about shameless commerce. And so, we have our practitioner program where we teach the whole performance consulting methodology and certify people. And the current group is going great, man. I'm so excited about this group. It's quite a mix, but our next cohort starts in June, and then we're going to have one in September. And you can find out more about it if you don't already know about it. Several of you have been through it already. And then we've got our study guides, which we've sort of not been pumping out a lot more, but we have been producing some study guides over the last year or so for our free ones. And if you want to subscribe to them, to our opt-in list. So thanks, Vincent. Appreciate it. And then the other thing, we've been talking about these application kits, which are going to be inexpensive digital products for quite a while, but we're finally sort of piloting the first one, which is about leadership practices. And I think that's going to be kind of interesting. And then this is just places to get more information. So thank you so much. Yes, Marie, the study guides, just sign up for them. And actually, I think you'll get all the current ones. I think when you sign up, you'll hit send or whatever, and you'll actually get a PDF document that has the current ones in it. If you've already signed up, we better get our act together and send you out the newest ones. But we haven't added any for a little while. Anyway, any other comments or questions, anybody? Oh, I'm seeing, there was somebody who wanted to speak. Erwin, well, we got 3 minutes, so let's see if you're up for it. I just approved you, but I'm not sure what happens there. Okay, Joe's left. I think probably our time is up and everybody has their next meeting. So here we go. So Erwin I'm just trying to figure out chat. We'll go to the chat box. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time. Hope this was useful to you. I think we're going to end.